Hey guys, in this video, let us see the roadmap to learn Spring, that is Spring framework using Spring Boot. If you are a Java developer and want to learn Spring framework with Spring Boot, then this video will guide you to get a structured learning path starting from the basics to the advanced concepts of Spring. If you are a fresher and very good in Java, if you want to step into a framework like Spring, then this video will really help you to understand what are the topics that you need to learn in Spring to become a pro in Spring framework. Now let us get started. What are the prerequisites that you need to know to learn Spring framework? As I have already told you, you need to have a very good knowledge in Java. Together with that, an attitude to learn Spring framework. What are the modules that you have to learn? These are the modules that you need to learn in case of Spring to become an expert in Spring framework. Starting from the basics to the advanced concepts. Spring Core, wherein you will be learning about Spring Context. Spring MVC to develop web application. Spring Data Access to integrate your Spring applications with the database. Spring REST to develop REST APIs using Spring framework. Spring Security to authenticate and authorize your Spring applications. For this, you need to learn Spring Security module. The very advanced part is Spring Deployment, that is to containerize your Spring applications using Docker. On top of this, if you are very comfortable in Spring framework, then you can move on to microservices architecture. Okay, now let us see these modules one by one. I will explain you what are the topics that you have to learn for each and every module, how to move from the basic to the advanced concepts. Whenever I am doing training, I always get this particular question. People say that they want to learn Spring Boot, not Spring framework. Always remember, Spring Boot is built on top of Spring framework. Spring Boot has certain advantages over Spring framework. That is why we are using Spring Boot. It is something like if I want to take water from a well, I don't have to go to the river to take water. I can open the tap in my house, which is going to give me easy accessibility of water. Similar to that is your Spring Boot. Spring framework is having all the core concepts. Spring Boot is built on top of Spring framework. Only if you are having a good understanding of the concepts in Spring framework, you can work with Spring Boot. So always start with the basics. So what are the topics that we need to concentrate in case of Spring? First, in case of the conceptual understanding, you need to understand what is Spring, why we are going in for Spring framework when we can comfortably develop standalone applications or REST APIs or web applications using Java. I hope you all know you can develop console based or standalone applications in Java, web applications using JSP and servlets. You can also create REST APIs using Java. Then why are we moving on to Spring framework? So these kind of informations you should be very comfortable enough. Then you have to understand what is IOC, inversion of control container. Then what are the two types of dependency injection? What is the concept of auto wiring? In all these, you should be doing more hands-on to understand about loosely coupled applications. Then, what is the scope of a Spring Bean in a Spring application? Then you have to understand what is Java-based configuration. People always get confused about this Java-based configuration. When to use this one? So, these kind of informations first you need to learn to develop a very good understanding in Spring framework. My dear guys, always remember you should not use any Spring starter project for this. You have to do all this using the Maven project only. If you are a Java developer, of course you know how to work with Maven. You will be going and adding all the relevant dependencies in pom.xml and then you will be working with your Java application. The same scenario is here for Spring also. You try to learn all these concepts using Maven project only. Meaning to say that you will be adding the relevant dependencies in pom.xml and you will be working on it. Only if you are comfortable working with how to create the IOC container all by yourself, how to use the concept of auto wiring, then you move on to Spring Boot. Now, Spring Boot is built on top of Spring framework. Spring Boot has more advantages than Spring framework, meaning to say that it supports automatic dependency management, It has embedded Tomcat server. It provides some metrics of your application. It enables auto configuration and more other features. If you are very good in Spring framework, you can understand these concepts of Spring Boot easily. So in case of Spring Boot, what are the conceptual understanding that you need to know? First is, what is Spring Boot? What is the meaning of auto configuration in Spring Boot? What are the advantages that you get if you are working with Spring Boot? What are the different types of annotations that are used with Spring Boot? That is, you use an annotation called as @Spring Boot application. What is the purpose of it? And whatever you have done over here, using this Spring Boot, you need to learn how to develop standalone applications. Of course, while working with Maven also, you can develop standalone applications. What I mean to say is, it is not just by creating a simple application using public static void main. You need to create an application which is going to have the client, that is the main class, a service layer, a utility class which is going to give the data. This is how you need to do your project. Let me show you a pictorial representation. So the first application that you will be doing will be with Maven, wherein you will be having a client which is having public static void main. From there you will be connecting to the service. In the service you will be having an interface and implementation class. You need to pick and choose a domain model. My favorite domain model is book always. So I need to create an interface and the corresponding implementation class. This is just like how you do an application in Java. In case of Java, your application is tightly coupled. Here it is going to be loosely coupled. And we don't have any database. So instead of having a database, we need some hard-coded values. You can have a utility package within which you can have a util class, something like a book util class, which is going to provide the data for your application. So whatever you have learnt in Maven, be it the concepts of auto wiring or scope or Java based configuration, try to replicate it using Spring Boot. In my training, this is how we do. First we start with basic Maven, wherein I ask the participants to go to the browser, select the Maven dependency for Spring context, copy it, add it to pom.xml, create the IOC container all by yourself and try working on the Spring concepts. In case of Spring Boot, it is enough. Just like how you order your food items in a delivery app. You open the menu, you pick and choose your items, you tick it, tuck, and then you add it to your cart, do a checkout and pay it. Similar to that, in case of Spring Boot, if you want to develop a web application or an application that is connecting to the database, it is enough you go and pick and choose the dependencies, whatever you need, and the application is getting created. Using Spring Boot also, you need to learn the concepts of Spring, whatever you have learned earlier. So, learning with Maven is something like you are doing the addition, subtraction and multiplication all by yourself. Working with Spring Boot is one level above, that is, you are using calculator for some basic operations like addition, subtraction and multiplication. For advanced operations, suppose say if you are working with integration and calculate, you will not be using calculator for everything. For the basic operations, you will be using the calculator. For the advanced operations, you will be doing it all by yourself. In case of Spring Boot, whatever basic setup is needed for your application is done with the help of Spring Boot. Okay, all these come under Spring Core module. That is, with the help of Core module, you can develop standalone applications, that is console based applications, where your applications can run in the console. This is the first part. Now, what next? So, the next step is to integrate your Spring Boot application with the database. For integrating your Spring Boot application with the database, depending upon the database, there are many different ways. Let me explain it to you first and then we will come back to the slide. So, the third part is to integrate with DB. So, based on the database that you are going to work with, you have to pick and choose the module. Suppose, if you are working with MySQL, you can go in for a simple Spring JDBC module, or you can use spring-data-jpa module. With the help of this, now you can integrate your Spring Boot application with the database. So in this case, instead of util package, I will be connecting to a repository interface. So this becomes my iBook repository, which will help me to connect to the database. As I told you, depending upon the database, you can pick and choose the module. If you are working with RDBMS database, you can work on this. If you are working with MyBatis, you need to select MyBatis starter database. And if you are working with MongoDB, you will have to select Spring MongoDB module. In case of NoSQL database, they are having their own modules. As in for Mongo, for Couchbase it is Spring Couchbase module. Okay. So this is how you integrate your application with the database. In this scenario, what are the topics that we need to learn? If you want to integrate your application with the database, of course you need to know how to query your database. So for that there are many different types of queries. As in, you can work with the inbuilt methods which are available in Spring framework, or you can use derived queries which you will be writing it all by yourself based on the properties, or you can work with named queries, or you can create your custom queries. As in, if you are working with JPA, data-jpa, so RDBMS uses data-jpa. JPA is an abstraction. Internally, it uses Hibernate, which is an ORM framework to connect to the database. My dear guys, this is only for RDBMS if you are working with spring-data-jpa. If you are using MyBatis, MyBatis is a persistence framework. Directly you can connect it. If you are working with MongoDB, of course you can connect to the database directly. Only in case of MySQL, you can pick and choose Spring JDBC, where you will be writing the code all by yourself. But if you are using spring-data-jpa, you will be using an ORM framework. In that case, you need to know how to work with the inbuilt methods, what are derived queries, what are named queries, what are custom queries. If you are using Hibernate, it is HQL, Hibernate Query Language. If you are working with JPA, then the custom queries that we will be writing will be JPQL, Java Persistence Query Language. In case of MongoDB and CouchDB, you will have to use the appropriate query language. If you are using MyBatis, in that case you will be using the native SQL query. As in, select star from book where book ID equal to question mark. Just like how you write the queries in Java while connecting to the database, or just like how you query the database from MySQL command line. So that is for MyBatis. In case of JPA, there is also one more thing that is called as native query. And of course, you also should know what is the meaning of caching. These are the basic concepts that you need to know if you are integrating your Spring Boot application with the database. Other than this, there are also few other mappings that you need to know if you are working with the database. Let me show it to you. The other topics that you need to learn while integrating your Spring Boot application with the databases. Number 1, association mapping. What are the different types of association? That is one to one, one to many, many to one, many to many. All these are available as annotations. You need to know how to work on this association mapping. Number 2, how to call a stored procedure from your Spring Boot application. How to call a view from a Spring Boot application. Then, how to perform projections. What is the meaning of projections? If I give select star from book, it returns all the columns of the table. But if my query is select title, author from book, this means I am trying to retrieve only the title and author. This is called as projection. You cannot work with the basic queries that I have shown you earlier for projection. There is a different approach while you are working with projections. So you need to know how to work with projections in a Spring Boot application. 5. You also should know how to perform inheritance mapping. What is the meaning of inheritance mapping? In case of your Spring Boot application, you can work with multiple domain model. Wherein there can be a hierarchy of classes. That is a superclass subclass scenario. I can have a superclass as address, the subclass as shipping address and billing address. Now, in case of the database, whether I want to have 3 different tables or one single table with all the column names, or 3 different tables with specific column names. So, these kind of concepts are dealt with inheritance mapping. These are few concepts that you should know if you want to integrate your Spring Boot application with the database. So, now we have moved from creating a basic application to an application which is connected to the database. So this is the third step. Let me move back to the slide. Let us have a quick view and then move on to the next step. Learn to integrate your Spring application to perform CRUD operation with the database. Choose the module, Spring JDBC module if you want to write the raw code, or you can work with spring-data-jpa if it is an RDBMS database, or if it is NoSQL database, you will have to choose the appropriate module. Learn about the different ways of querying the database which I have shown you, and also learn about association mapping, inheritance mapping, calling stored procedures, calling a view, and projections. The next step is to develop web application using Spring Boot. Before jumping into the hands-on part, you should know what are the concepts that you need to learn in case of Spring MVC application. If you are a Java developer or if you are a person who has worked in Java extensively, you know that we can develop web applications using JSP and servlet. Wherein, in case of JSP and servlets also we use MVC architecture. In case of Spring, the MVC architecture that we are going to work with is completely different from what we have learnt earlier. Here we are having a single point of entry which is called as the dispatcher servlet. You should know what is the purpose of dispatcher servlet. This MVC architecture is also called as front controller design pattern. What is the purpose of this dispatcher servlet? Actually, this dispatcher servlet extends HTTP servlet. If you have worked in JSP and servlets, of course you know that. This dispatcher servlet is responsible for handling all the operations of your MVC application. It is doing some delegation work. You need to understand this particular concept exclusively because it is very important part of your Spring MVC architecture. The next step is you need to know about certain annotations that are used in an MVC application, as in at controller, at request mapping, at request param, and few other annotations. Now, after you have understood the concepts, start developing your web applications using Spring Boot. First, develop simple web applications using Spring Boot without the database. Then, learn to integrate your Spring web application with the database. Guys, actually in this part, you should have an end-to-end application. Let me explain it with a pictorial representation. Let me rub this off. The fourth one is develop web application. Let me explain the flow, how actually we have moved from the basic to the advanced concepts. Let me first start with Maven. In case of Maven, you will be having a proper client class which is having public static void main PSVM, which is connecting to the service layer. The service layer is going to have our iBook service and book service implementation. iBook service is the interface, book service implementation is the class, which is connecting to a utility package which is having book util class. This class is going to have static data. We will be working with this. So this is a simple Spring application developed using Maven, wherein you will be learning the concepts of auto wiring and scopes. Now next, using Spring Boot. While working with Spring Boot, of course here also you will be having the class which is having public static void main. From there you will be connecting to the service layer. As usual, you will be having the interface iBook service and book service IMPL. This public static void main class will be annotated with at Spring Boot application. From this we will be connecting to book util class which is in util package. If you notice, though the structure looks similar, the operation of Spring Boot is completely different. The idea over here is, first we are learning how to develop a Spring application using Maven. Then we are modifying the same application using Spring Boot. Now you know how to develop a simple Spring application using Spring Boot. The next step is to integrate with database. Already I have shown you the pictorial representation. Again, as usual, we are having the service layer, having iBook service and book service implementation. This time we are not working with the static data, so we need a repository interface which is iBook repository, which is responsible for connecting to the database. This is dynamic data, and my dear guys, this is also a standalone application, meaning to say that you will be seeing all the output only in the console. Now the next step is to develop web application. In case of web application, you will not have public static void main. Rather, you will be having the front end, which will be having the JSP pages. So this will be your client, literally the browser. From there, you are coming to the middleware. In the middleware part, you will be having your service layer and the repository layer. Together with that, you will be having the controller classes. So there are controller classes and the service classes. Again, as usual, the same iBook service, book service IMPL. If you are working in a web application wherein you are renting the books, online book library, in that scenario, you will be having other domain models also, as in customer, billing, address, card, and so many other domain models. Here I have just selected one particular domain model and I am explaining it. And from this, again, as usual, it will go to the repository layer. Of course, we need the books to be stored in the repository, right? So we will be having the database. So you are developing a web application to perform CRUD operation with the database. Your application will look something like this. When the client is opening this particular application, in the front end, you will be having a search box, and when you click search by author, it has to show you the list of books. By default, all the books will be shown. If you are selecting by author, it has to show the list of books only by this particular author. And of course, you can have as many number of JSP pages. So you will be having a view also. View is nothing but the JSP page. If you notice, this is a proper MVC architecture model. This book service becomes your model part, that is your book service plus the domain model class becomes your model. This is your controller and this is your view. Model, view, controller architecture. Okay. Now that you have learned how to develop web applications and integrate it with the database, what next? The next step is to develop REST APIs using Spring Boot. For this, you should not jump into the application directly. First, you need to get an overview of web services. If you are a Java developer, if you have worked with web services, then directly jump into Spring REST APIs. But if you are a fresher, if you are learning Spring for the first time, if you don't know what are web services, first understand what are web services. There are two types of web services, big web services and REST web services. REST APIs come under REST web services. You need to understand the concepts about REST API. What is the meaning of client-server architecture? What are resources? What are the HTTP methods? What is the meaning of content negotiation? In which format does the REST API returns the data to the client? So these kind of conceptual understanding you need to know in case of REST API. And then start working on developing REST APIs. Here also we will be working with Spring Boot. There are many annotations that are used in case of REST APIs, as in at rest controller, and I told you about the HTTP methods. For all the HTTP methods, we are having the appropriate annotation at get mapping, at post mapping, at put mapping, at patch mapping, and so on. In case of REST APIs, there are many annotations available. Here I have just added only at rest controller. For all the HTTP methods that I told, there are appropriate annotations at get mapping, at put mapping, at post mapping, at patch mapping, at delete mapping. Then at request param, if you want to retrieve the data from a form. At path variable, if you want to retrieve the data from a path variable itself. Then after having an understanding of all these concepts, develop simple REST APIs using Spring Boot. Here also, first initially don't include any database. Once you are comfortable developing REST APIs using Spring Boot, for all the annotations that I have told, move on to integrate your REST API to perform CRUD operation with the database. The same scenario which is similar to your MVC application, there you are having the views also. Here you will not have any view. The application itself will start only from the controller. Let me show the pictorial representation of the REST API. So the next step is develop REST API. So in this case, how the application will look like? You will not have any client. Let me show you a pictorial representation of the REST API. When a request comes in, it directly hits only the controller class that is annotated with at controller. So you will be having as usual controller. So this whole part will be available as a REST API. So here will be the controller, and together with that, as usual, the service layer and the repository layer which is connected to the database. Now notice whatever view page we had in our MVC application will be missing in case of REST API, because REST API is just going to generate the data and it is going to return the content to the client. The client can be any kind of application. The content can be in the form of JSON or XML or text or any other custom content negotiation that you are asking for. Once you have developed the REST API, it is mandatory that you need to test your REST API. When you are working in a Java application, if you want to test it, you will run the application, you can see the output in the console. Similarly, here also you can see the output in the console. In case of Spring Boot, for the basic one, you can see the output in the console. But if when you are developing a web application, you can see the web application output in the browser. As in, you will see the proper UI because we are working with JSP. What about REST API? How to test the REST API? For testing the REST API, we will be using an app called as Postman. With the help of Postman, we will be testing all the REST endpoints that are available in our application. We will be using so many methods, right? HTTP methods, get method, put method, post method. For each and every method, we need to have the appropriate methods which are annotated with the appropriate annotations like get mapping, put mapping, post mapping and so on. Let me go back to the slide. So, learn to test your application using Postman. Now my REST API is ready. All the REST endpoints are working perfectly fine. Now I need to give it to the client. The client can access my REST APIs very easily. But how does he know what is the URL that I have provided for the REST APIs, that is the REST endpoints? So for that we need to generate the documentation. The documentation can be generated for the REST API using Swagger. Now it is called as Open API specification. You need to add certain annotations to your class. Automatically it will generate the complete documentation that is needed for your REST API. Once the document is given to the client can access this particular REST API from his application. The document can be in the form of YAML or XML or JSON. You can pick and choose any format. Earlier it was JSON. Now the latest accepted format is YAML, YAML, yet another markup language. Okay, now our REST API is ready. We have tested our REST API using Postman. We have generated the document and given the document to the client. What next? We need to authenticate and authorize the client who is trying to access our REST API. The next step is to authenticate our Spring applications. So for that we will be working with Spring security module. There are different ways of authenticating and authorizing our Spring applications. As in, you can work with in-memory authentication wherein you will be programmatically giving the username and password, which is of course not feasible in a real-time scenario. You can work with JPA specific authentication, as in the user details are stored in the database, or you can use OAuth specific authentication and authorization. What exactly is the meaning of it? Suppose say I am trying to access a particular website. It is asking me to register myself to that website. I do not want to register. So is there any other way to access the website? They provide you with few options. Login using Gmail, login using LinkedIn, login using Facebook. So I can choose any of this authentication mechanism to authenticate myself to enter into the website. So that is achieved with the help of OAuth authentication. The next one is JWT, which is a famous authentication methodology, JSON Web Tokens. In case of JSON Web Tokens, after the user is authenticated, the token is stored in the client machine. Whenever a request goes from the client machine to the server, the token will be carried back and forth in the request. So this is a very interesting topic to learn, this JWT. Okay. Now my REST API is authenticated. I have got a solid REST API which can be used by any client. What next? The advanced part that you need to learn is how to containerize your Spring applications with Docker. You should not directly jump into the application part. First, you need to understand the fundamentals of Docker, the Docker architecture. What is Docker engine, Docker client, Docker server, Docker image, Docker containers. What is the meaning of Docker network, Docker volumes. First, get an understanding about the Docker specific concepts. Then learn how to Dockerize or containerize your Spring Boot application in Docker. If you are writing a simple Spring application without connecting to the database, it is very easy to containerize it. But if you are having a Spring REST API which is integrated with the database, it means you cannot work with a simple YAML file. You need to understand the concept of networking. You need to understand the concept of volumes. That is, I am not going to have MySQL database locally. I will be taking the Docker image of my database from the Docker Hub. So you should understand the basic concepts of Docker before containerizing your Spring application, like Docker Compose, what is Docker Hub, and so on. Let me go back to the pictorial representation. So after developing REST API, authenticate and authorize, and the last step is to deploy your Spring REST API. So guys, as I told you, if you are following this proper structured learning path, you will really become a pro in Spring Boot. This I can assure you. Okay, what next? Now let us understand what is the version of Spring Boot that we need to learn, what is the Spring Framework version, what is the IDE that we can use, and what are the tools that are needed for working with Spring Boot. The Spring Boot version that you need to choose is versions greater than 3.x. The latest version is 3.2.5, which is a stable version. It is better to work with 3.1 because in every 2 months they will be updating the version. The latest version that is supported in the industry is 3.1.x. And what is the appropriate Spring version? The Spring version that you will be working with is 6.0. That is Spring versions greater than 6.0. You can use 6.2 also. Then the Java version that is needed is Java 17. If you are working with Spring Boot version greater than 3.x, it is mandatory that you need to install Java 17. Then the IDE that you can work with is Spring Toolsuite for working with Spring Boot, because you will get the Spring Initializer, which is nothing but the Spring Starter project easily. For working with the basic Maven application, it is enough that you can use Eclipse or IntelliJ. That is the basic part that I told you, creating a simple Spring application using Maven. So for all that you can use either Eclipse or IntelliJ. You create a simple Maven project, open pom.xml, add the appropriate dependencies and run it as a simple application. If you are using Spring Boot, you better use Spring Toolsuite, or of course you can work with IntelliJ also. In case of Community Edition, I don't know whether there is a plugin available. Earlier there was a plugin wherein you can select and download the Spring Initializer. But if you are working in a corporate and if you are having the corporate edition of IntelliJ, it is very easy. You will be getting this plugin. In that case, you can use IntelliJ. IntelliJ is far more better and faster than Spring Toolsuite, but I don't know whether the support of plugin is available for the Community Edition. My personal choice is Spring Toolsuite. When you are working with your Spring Boot application, you need to integrate it with the database. So you can use MySQL versions greater than 8.0 or MongoDB in case of NoSQL database versions greater than 4.x. The next thing, we will be developing web applications. In case of web applications, you need Tomcat server. If you are developing REST APIs, in that scenario, you will be working with the embedded Tomcat server that is available. But in case of a web application, that is an MVC application, you need to use an external Tomcat server. The version of external Tomcat server should be 10.x, not below that. Other than all this, if you want to deploy your application in Docker, you need to have Docker installed in your system. So these are the tools that are needed for developing and working with your Spring Boot application. I hope it is clear. Let me put everything in a simple nutshell. One is, you need to know the basics of Spring. For that, first start with Maven and then move on to Boot just for the Spring core part. Then integrating with database, then developing MVC applications, then working with REST APIs, then authenticating using Spring security, then deploying. These are the 6 main modules that you have to learn to become a Spring Pro. I assure you, if you are taking the structured learning path, you can really learn Spring in a very comfortable manner. Okay, now how to learn Spring? Now that you are clear with the topics of Spring Framework, do a self-learning. Browse on the videos and the topics that are available in the net. based on the flow that I have given, start learning the concepts of Spring framework. If you are still finding it difficult, take a support of a mentor to get these concepts cleared. Next, take a structured learning path. Again and again I will tell only this. If you are taking a structured learning path in learning any technology, it is way too easier to understand it and get the proper flow of any application. If you notice in our Spring learning path also, we have started from the very basic and in the end we have reached a scenario where we can deploy our Spring application in Docker. Okay, how many months will it take to learn Spring framework? If you are a Java developer, already very comfortable in Java, and if you can dedicate 2 hours per day, then you can be a pro of Spring framework within a month. If you are a fresher, just now have completed Java or in the path of learning Java, together with that if you want to learn Spring framework, and if you can dedicate 2 hours per day, you can complete Spring or you can learn Spring within 2 months. Again, if you are a person who is committed to learn this technology and if you want to finish it within 15 days, you need to put 4 hours per day. You have to sit and work dedicatedly so that you can become a pro in Spring. As I told you always, practice, practice, practice. That is the real mantra to become a pro in any technology. If you are dedicating yourself to learn a particular technology, you need to make your hands dirty by doing as many applications as possible in case of Spring Boot. Only then you can become a pro or expert within a month or within 2 months. That's it. I hope this is helpful. Thank you.